I would like to introduce Charlotte Milkins. So she is a local historian. She is also a researcher. She's completed her master's in history and does a lot of her own personal research, endeavouring to write her own research in the future. So we're very excited to have her here today to talk about how to begin research and how to pull threads out of research that you can find and moving forward. Thank you, Charlotte.
Thank you, Kate. Okay, so essentially, as Kate said, I did a Masters of History, which I finished back in 2020. And since then, I have been trying to do my own personal research, focusing on local history. I did my thesis on bushfire history in Victoria. So a lot of my research does tend to focus in local libraries and in the States. So I thought it might be useful to kind of share my expertise, so to speak. So basically today I'm going to show you an idea I had for a research topic and how I developed the idea. And from there, I'll kind of outline different resources you can use that are pretty easy to use as long as you can use the internet or you can go to your local library. You should be able to access all these sources today. So, okay. So every project starts with an idea. I know it sounds basic, but it's just the way it is. You can have a blurry image. You can just have something vague, a single word that you want to focus on. And thankfully, we have the internet these days, which makes that starting with a vague idea a lot easier. So this particular project of mine started with my university degree. Until that point, I'd focused on disaster history, so bushfires, earthquakes, all those sort of situations. But as one of my subjects were about criminals and criminal history, I wanted to do something focused in Australia. And I didn't really know much beyond the basic Ned Kelly sort of aspects of local history. And I wanted to find a female to cover because I find female criminality quite fascinating, and I wanted to find someone who is Australian when doing my essay about their life and how they were portrayed based on their crime. So the subject itself wanted you to show like what led them to making their choices and how the society they lived in responded to their crime. When I first got the essay topic, I was a little lost. I didn't know exactly how to approach it. So I decided to utilize the good old Google search. So many people assume that Google is a weak tool when it comes to research. And whilst it is very true, you should check the veracity of your results because anyone can publish anything online. And these days you can find yourself repeating information that is very untrue. So small blogs can be really useful, but be very careful and make sure you check where they're getting their information from because, you might end up repeating something that is very inaccurate and it will lead you down the wrong path. And you don't want to do family history and find out 5 generations in that you've found the wrong direction for your family tree. So first I decided to search women on trial for murder in Australia because I wanted to do a murder case. It's kind of the most interesting and it tends to be more publicly covered than many other crimes. So when I was looking for a person to write about, I wanted to choose someone that had a lot of contemporary newspaper articles. So when I searched for that, I found the Adelaide Jail website. It has a historical website where it shows criminals that were in the prison in the 1800s and the 1900s. And this is where I found Mary Schippan. So she's the lady looking a bit solemn on screen there. She was only 25 years old when she was accused of murdering her 14-year-old little sister. And this case happened out in a rural property. It was about 2-3 hours from Adelaide. And back at that time, you could only really travel via train or cart. So it was basically a day's trip to the major city, and it was just a small farming crime. So she was one of 7 children, I believe. There was a couple that passed when they were young, and she was the oldest surviving child that was at home. There was 2 older brothers, and yeah, the murder was very brutal. And when it happened, the newspapers went crazy. This crime was all over Australia, it even went international. And that made really interesting research because newspapers are a great sort of source for opinions. I wouldn't necessarily say that newspapers are the best source for accurate information all the time, but they are very good for like forming understandings of what everyone in that society felt, because they tend to like to publish what the trial by public like to think. So Mary was instantly the suspect by the police, and she went on trial. And the trial was very much focused on her having a relationship outside of marriage. She was unmarried. She never married after the trial, anything like that. So the trial became less about the fact that she was the one in the house with her sister at the time, and more about the fact that she happened to have a boyfriend. And so I don't want to get into that too much, because obviously that's not the topic of today's seminar, but I ended up writing an essay about her life, and I found it very fascinating. I'd recommend researching the case if you ever get the time, because it's one of my favorite sort of little rabbit holes to go down occasionally. So when we're doing research, it's okay if you don't know what you want to do from the start. Like a lot of the time when I've done topics, it started with just a keyword, like just a single word. Like I wanted to look criminality, family tree stuff, certain towns, certain times. And all you have to do is just click on some results, get a little deeper. It's kind of like, so that's kind of how I got to the Mary Schippan case. I literally just searched that, then I searched for a certain time period. Like you can just let Google do its thing. Now, once you've gotten your Google results and you've decided kind of a thread of what you want to search, it's a great idea to dive into what you find. Now, there is multiple sorts of research, I guess, tools you can use. You can use books, you can use the internet, you can use obviously the local library and newspaper resources. With the Mary Schippan case, I found a bit of a combination of all these really helped me get a succinct idea of what I wanted to write about. So this is a screenshot of the Adelaide jail website, and it's just got kind of a bit of a blog about Mary, and that's kind of how I got the little keywords that I had to research later on, because it's very easy to just search, say, the name of the person that you're researching and not think about the fact that they had parents, they had siblings. Each person can have a whole new set of resources to go into. On the other side, there's a couple of books here. They're both non-fiction, supposedly, but they take very different perspectives of the case. Now, this can be good and it can be bad depending on what you want to do with the tools you've got. So the book on the right, The Towering Tragedy, is probably the main source I used for my essay, because it was written by the nephew of Mary's boyfriend, and he actually met Mary. Well, he met a lot of people that actually knew Mary, and he met the boyfriend and all that and heard direct sort of firsthand information of the case. So I found it a lot like very useful, but you had to approach it with a certain bias, because obviously being the nephew of someone who got slandered by the media during the case, he's very, very quick to accuse the media of putting everyone else on trial instead of who actually did it. And the one on the other side by Peter Donovan, it takes pretty much the idea that Mary did do it. She definitely killed her sister, and it takes more the traditional view of the case. So it focuses on believing everything that was printed in the newspapers, even knowing Richard actually does highlight a lot of the times the newspapers got the information wrong. So it's pretty much a great idea to look at these sort of sources and actually scrutinize what you find, because it can be very easy to get excited when you find a source that's actually related to what you want to search, especially when it's a niche. So yeah, like I think it's good to have these sort of, I guess, more personalized sources, but also remember that, like all of us, there's going to be biases. So after looking at these books and the blogs, I went to Trove, which Trove is one of the best sources, I think, for any sort of history research. Like, I wish I could just spend every day on this website because I find it really interesting. When you're searching newspaper articles or even any sort of old searches, you really need to take note of the fact that a lot of AIs and a lot of transcribing will get names wrong. And even the sources at the time, a lot of people went by several different spellings of their names because they actually didn't know either how to spell their name, or the person recording the information didn't know the spelling of the name. So even on my own family history sort of research, I found that several family members whose names I did know were written very differently in birth certificates and other information. So when you're searching Trove and other websites, be aware that you could just try a few different spellings of the name, because you will actually get some different results sometimes. I also found Trove very useful because it actually has a lot of filters, time periods, the sort of articles you're looking for, locations. So as you can see in the screenshot here, it's got the date that the article was published. So you can sort it by the earliest to the latest article, which is how I usually use the newspaper sources, because as a case is developing, sometimes information will get reported differently, and you can actually watch how the information develops day by day. My advice is, if you're searching longer than 50, 60 years ago now, like before the 1950s, try and search locally to where the case or the person lived, because if they did happen to do something that spread further out, like into a national sort of story, the information does tend to get murky, and they'll just like kind of copy each other, and it will get like further and further away from what you're actually trying to find. And beyond that, a lot of the time, each state, when they got information about cases, would be a couple of days behind the local sources. So I find it a lot easier to try and search within the state of the case. But if you're wanting to do something a bit more general, you can just use the whole national source. So yeah, I found the newspapers a really useful information resource, because they, as I said before, they do tend to show what the public opinion of the time is. So now, understanding your strengths and shortcomings is something that university taught me very early on. I went into university doing my undergraduate in professional and creative writing, and one part of my university course was you would write something and the whole class would workshop it. So you'd basically have to have everyone tell you how they felt about your your writing, which kind of felt very hurtful at the time, but it came from a good place. And it's really important to learn where your strengths and shortcomings are in any field, including research. So a major shortcoming can be money. A lot of resources these days you can access for free or very cheap, or do as like I guess when you can have the trial period, which is very useful. I was informed by Kate that you guys can have access to a lot of the Ancestry sort of basics, which is really useful, because I found Ancestry was the most expensive resource for me, because I liked using as much of the primary information that I could find. A lot of the time I wasn't using Ancestry for a family tree, I was using it for other research, so I didn't need the tree feature. And for once, it's about $25 a month to get a decent sort of subscription to Ancestry. So using the library resource, I believe you've got the basics. I don't know what features of Ancestry you guys get to use.
Yeah, so any library patrons can come in branch and use it, and they get access to all of the records. They just can't make family trees or have conversations on the forums.
Yeah, so the resources, actually being able to use the documents, and that's probably the most important and the best part of Ancestry. So I'd recommend utilizing that if you can, and especially if the library is offering it for free. Like, I've spent so much money on Ancestry over the years. Now, resources can actually trick you a little bit. As I said before, people went by several different names. Now, when researching Mary, I found her name at first being Mary Schippan. Like, that was how all the newspapers reported it. It was how the Adelaide jail website reported it. But when I actually tried searching for Mary on Ancestry and that, I found it difficult to find any sort of resources. And it turned out that Mary was born Maria and had a middle name. And obviously, like, that sort of information tends to be lost to time, especially in the early 1900s. So this is how, like, this is Mary's birth details. And you can see in the case, it mentioned Mary's dad's name being Matthias, but here it's written as Martin. So it's two very different names, but because they came originally from an area in Germany, their names, they tend to make a more English Australian sort of sounding. So they go by multiple different names. So that's just something to keep in mind. Like, you may think it's not the resource that you're looking for, but it actually could be. You just got to kind of play a bit detective and line up what information you've got that you know, alongside what's written on the source here. So, like, I knew Mary had been born in 1877. So, and she was born in Tawitta, which was a very small town. So I was like, okay, by process of elimination, I can figure that this is Mary. She's just got a very different name. So now let's go into how to use individual resources. So it seems pretty obvious to say Google, I know, but Google has so many little tools built into it that are really useful. It took me a couple of years to actually utilize Google to its fullest potential. So using different keywords will actually get different results for you. I noticed that when searching Mary's case, searching her full name came with different results to just Mary Schippan. So when you're actually researching something, try a few different words, try moving them around a little bit. You can actually get a few different results that you weren't expecting to get. And not always does this help, but it's a good little trick to try at times. So Google Images is another useful source. The most basic way for searching images and people and events. It can be quite useful too to find other resources. So here, as you can see, I've searched for Mary and it's come up with photos from the trial. These were the photos printed in the newspapers at the time. But being able to click on the image and see what website it's come from, you can go onto those websites and sometimes they'll have more information or exclusive photos that you actually don't have come up in the Google search results. Once again, the AI can play against you and it won't always show everything that's relevant to the case. But I found this useful because it helps me find the state libraries resources on the case, because I'm not from South Australia, so I don't know what their local resources are like. So it was very useful to actually be able to find different articles about the case written by other historians or people that were interested. And beyond that, you can also find better quality images. So sometimes there'll be the same image printed multiple times on the results search, but actually clicking on and looking at the dimensions of the image, you can find more higher quality images of the same amount. Looking at related images, you can also see images that are related to probably the same topic. Another part of Google is Google Scholar and books. These aren't used as much by people because I think a lot of people don't understand how it works. I, to be honest, don't necessarily completely understand how it works, but I've found it quite useful at times. So here you can actually search for books that are related to the topic, and sometimes you'll be able to purchase them, or you'll at least just find where they're referencing what you're looking at. So here is a couple of results on the case of Mary. The top one is the Peter Donovan book, which I showed earlier in the slide. The second one is actually a fictionalized account of the case. And I did read it. To be honest, I wasn't the biggest fan, but that was probably me approaching it as a historian. But yeah, so you can find different information, as well as, I don't know if you can see further at the bottom there, like got memoirs of John McConnell Black. So essentially it's other people that have written about the situation, but it's not actually been the focus of the book. So you can find, say, a reference to someone in a passing thing where someone's gone, oh, I witnessed this today, this person did this. So someone going, they actually witnessed the case firsthand, but they've only written about it in a page of the book. So it's really useful for like Google Books, that you can actually find where there's just been a brief mention of what you're looking for. Google Scholar is also really useful if you're looking for more academic based articles, but to be honest, it can be a bit expensive to actually read those articles. It depending on, now a lot of the libraries do offer actual resources to look at scholarly articles without having to pay. I know the state library does, and some of them in the local libraries too do. So I wouldn't worry about Google Scholar if you're just doing basic research, but it is also one that can have some really interesting articles to read. Obviously, I've already mentioned Trove. It's one of my favorite resources. It's quite handy. Let's see. You can also find on Trove diaries and photos and little things like lists and stuff that people have made. I tend to focus on using the newspaper resources, but I did find someone who had made a list about the Mary Schippan case and pretty much had listed resources that they had used. So it can be useful to actually find what other people have found in their own research. It saves, you know, a bit of time if you're not quite sure what you're doing yet, and see what other researchers have done. And over here that I've highlighted is the refining your search one, which is my favorite because I like to search locally and search the time period that I'm researching. So it's pretty, I mentioned how to use that before, and how to, the little box here is actually just choosing if you want to look at the relevance or go from the earliest article or the latest article. I find it best to just search from the earliest article and look through, because obviously the AI or whoever's transcribing it won't always necessarily get it right in terms of what it's reading. So like it could say, you think it says Mary Schippan, but it actually says someone else's name altogether. It's just how it's been scanned into the system. Doesn't always necessarily show what it's meant to show. This next resource is the Birth, Deaths and Marriages website. So for Victoria, we have a really good system for BDM. I've tried some other states' research, like researching stuff, and their websites aren't as clear as the Victorian ones. So we're pretty lucky there with that. This here is the history searching portion of the website. So you can actually pay for records of family members if you can't find the actual certificate on Ancestry, which very rarely will you be able to actually get the proper certificate on Ancestry. You'll find a record of the birth and have all the information, but the actual like physical certificate will be very difficult to find unless you pay for it. So I actually recently got a few different family certificates from this website, including my grandparents' wedding certificate. So my grandfather is still alive, but after 60 years, the public can actually pay and have the certificate. So for births, I believe it's 100 years after the birth, and it's something like 25 years after death, you can like look at a death certificate. So if it falls outside of that range, you can actually just pay for a certificate. So I've got a few different ones. I was able to find my great-grandfather's birth certificate and find out his mother's name, which was something that wasn't shared very often in the family because it was very controversial. He was put in an orphanage. So you can actually find a lot of relevant information on the local birth, deaths and marriages website if you are actually willing to pay to get the certificate. But you can actually just do a search and get enough information without paying for the certificate. So essentially you just use this is the search feature here, and you can search last names, first names, dates, if you know kind of the year range they were born or died or married. Again, there will be different spellings come up. I find sometimes different names come up very differently. So I usually try to search just the family name and the year range, because I find you're more likely to find the right information because people went by several different first names back then. So here's more ways you can search on the website. It includes like a ship if it happened coming over to Australia. It can show maiden names, spouses' names. I find it best to search for, if you're searching for someone that doesn't have a father listed on the certificate, I would recommend just searching the mother's name, because quite often there was just no father listed on the certificate. It's something I found. I've always tried to like put the mother's name in the maiden name section, and it's like doesn't get your results. So just search the mother's name if you're looking at that sort of information. Next research is Ancestry. I've already kind of covered a little bit, but this is the search feature on Ancestry. I find it very useful, but it can sometimes get a little congested in your search results. So for me, I find it tends to blur like it. Okay, so Australia has, in our history, obviously, a lot of Australians have come as immigrants from different countries. So whenever you search for someone in Australia, Ancestry just loves to show you European records, assuming that everyone's come over to Australia at some point. But I find filtering out and just looking for Australian records if you're looking for someone that is like who was born and passed in Australia. You can sometimes have people turn up that have the same similar name at a similar birth year, but aren't actually the person you're looking for. So I'd be really careful when searching on Ancestry. I just found in the past I've actually made mistakes on who someone was because they had very similar biographical information, but they actually weren't the same person. So yeah, especially if they've got a very common name. So I won't talk too long about Ancestry, as there is quite a few resources on the library website for that sort of stuff. Next, we got WikiTree. Now, WikiTree was one I actually didn't discover till recently. I've been doing my family tree, and I've actually traced it back to 0 BC, which took a very long time. There's about 15,000 people on my family tree at the moment, but we'll ignore that chaos. And WikiTree is very useful for further back information. Now, it will actually be quite open about the fact that a lot of the information isn't necessarily going to be accurate if you're tracing further back than, say, 700 AD. You're going to struggle to find like very concrete information about parents, marriage, and kids. So this person here, which I'm not even going to try to attempt to pronounce that name, is technically one of my ancestors. As you can see, it's a bit shady in terms of someone's commented in the forums that the son was born after the mother died. This isn't possible. And a lot of the source information can be a bit like difficult to decipher, but it can be really useful to find. People do tend to list different articles in that mention that person in the comments. So if you're just looking into your own family history especially, it's really useful. So this is what I'm talking about in terms of sources. So it can have different books that mention the person, or other people can like Wikipedia, the actual main website. WikiTree can be edited by anyone who has an account. So people who are actually historians in different countries can actually put in information and stuff that they know. So there is quite a few groups that actually monitor this website, including like there's a Scandinavian history project, I believe, and the medieval history project. So they add information as well as references in books and in encyclopedias and stuff to different people. So it's really useful if you do your family tree or you trace back a little further, you can actually find like a lot of really interesting figures, but you don't actually have to just use it for family tree research. I just find it helped in that source. Especially the further back you trace your family tree, you're more likely to find someone of nobility. Everyone that can trace their tree past a certain point is related to nobility. So you can actually find proper Wikipedia pages for people and that, which can be very useful in tracing family trees with a bit more concrete information where you can. Here we've got the Public Records Office of Victoria. So this is another one of my favourite resources. It is actually one that you can visit in person as well in Melbourne and physically see the resources themselves, like photos, cases, land records, everything pretty much is kept at the Records Office. I believe it is in North Melbourne, but I haven't had a chance to go physically yet because of the pandemic. So they have online, they've started to digitalize a lot of their records. So as you can see here, there is photos. So this is from World War I, the murder of Archduke Ferdinand, which is very it's quite interesting to see like newspaper photos from that sort of period. Now I use like the public records most frequently for, they have digitalized their list of female convicts, well, not convicts, criminals in Victoria and Melbourne that went to jail between 1850 and 1940. So you can actually look at the scanned document of their criminal record. And it's really useful for finding biographical information on people that have been incarcerated. Although I do note once again that a lot of these people lied, because if you're getting arrested, you're not going to give them your whole life story. They have a user guide on how to use the Public Records Office. I find it so useful. It's helped me learn how to use the website because it can be a little scary to start off with. So they have a whole book that you can read that tells you how to use the website and how to get records brought out of the collection for you to view at their office. This is probably one of the last sources that I'd recommend using online. This is the National Archives of Australia. They're very good, especially for military resources. I was able to get letters that my great-great-grandmother wrote to get the release of my great-grandfather's war medals and stuff like that. So you can find actual letters people have written in terms of relating to military service, as well as their admission forms and what medals they received. And if someone passed in war, it has a lot of information about what the commanding officers knew about their deaths and stuff. So it's quite useful there. I'd recommend, if you're wanting to search for someone that served in the Australian military, use the National Archives. I think they have the most vast amount of information, and they're quite easy to actually search. And the last and most obvious resource is the library. Especially you guys on the Cardinia website have so much information. I'm very jealous. I wish I'd had it back when I was 18. And you can pretty much just go to your local library. A lot of libraries have localized information, including actual town related documents, which I recommend because a lot of them don't end up online. So as Kate will be able to tell you, I actually found a lot of local information at my own library at the time when I was doing bushfire history. So a lot of that didn't end up on the internet, but you can actually do it physically in person. So yeah, this is the end of my presentation. I know it kind of brushed the surface, but I didn't want to terrify people too much. And essentially my advice is to just go into it and not expect anything. Just choose a word, go crazy. It's a fun process. I think there's too much pressure put on. Like, research as an academic term. It can just be like crafting. It's finding something that interests you and just going crazy. So thank you guys for listening. And thanks to Kate for inviting me to do this presentation.